excited to invite on stage Professor Andrew Maynard and Parth, and they are going to be in conversation for the final fireside chat for the day. Could I please request Professor Maynard and Parth to kindly turn on their videos? A very quick introduction for our guest of honor here today. Professor Andrew Maynard has joined us from all the way in Arizona State University. He's a scientist, an author, a communicator, and an internationally recognized expert and thought leader in emerging technologies and their socially responsible and ethical development and use. He currently serves as the Associate Dean of Curricula and Student Success in the ASU College of Global Futures and is Director of the ASU Risk Innovation Lab. He is going to be in conversation with Parth, one of our ISF backend moderators who's going to be interviewing him. Parth is joining us from IIT Roorkee, where he's studying as a master's student. And this is going to be one of our very exclusive ISF book talks. Professor Maynard, needless to say that we're very, very excited to host you at India Science Festival. And the topic that we're going to be discussing today is of such importance. So many of our attendees are very, very excited to put in their questions to you. We'll be relaying their questions via Parth. We'll be taking them from social media, YouTube, where we're relaying this event live. And we'll ask you all their questions toward the end of the session. So without any further delay, Parth, over to you. Take the fireside chat ahead.
Thank you, Shruti. Thank you so much. So over here, it's a very, very good evening. So good evening, Professor Maynard. And I am assuming that, since you're in the United States, it'll be a good morning to you.
It's good morning here, but good evening to you, Parth. Yes.
Good evening. Yeah. So first, for all the audience members, I read your book. So I read Professor Maynard's book called Futurizing. And it has been a wonderful read. So I'm an avid reader anyway, and I love to read. And I have not read a book like this in a very long time, and throughout the course of the chat you guys will find out exactly why I say what I say. So since Shruti's given us such a wonderful introduction, let's just jump into the chat. So sir, the first question that I wanted to ask you is, in your book you've written, and there's this very beautiful quote that I'll be picking up from the book, that for every oscillation, every turn of the atom electron spinning top, emitted light waves slice like a metaphorical knife between what has just been and what's to come. Without light, there is no past and no future. And without the past and future, there is no light. So, Professor, how do you reconcile the circuitous nature of these two phenomena in relation to the one directionality of our movement in our lives?
This is such a great question. And I should start off by saying, first of all, thank you for picking out that quote. I love that phrase and that imagery. But I also want to say, I was listening to Neha's talk, and she fit this up perfectly, talking about sort of our relationship with the future and how so many things can go wrong, but there's something in the spirit of humanity that gives us hope for the future. So that was a perfect setup. And then when you look at this relationship between atomic oscillations and light and the future, and as you say, that the circularity of this, there are so many aspects to this. So the first thing I would say is it's not so much circular as it's integrated. There is a deep integration between how our world, how our universe works at the atomic and subatomic level, and how it operates, and how then we fit in with this universe, and how we're actually part and parcel of time. So that idea of light being almost the metronome of the universe, but being connected to matter, is simply an integration of the fact that we're caught in this flow of time going from past to future. But of course, it's far more than that, because as you begin to look at this, this idea of circularity, first of all, it touches on what we're beginning to understand of the nature of reality, especially coming from quantum physics, where things aren't quite as linear as we think. They look linear simply because we're creatures of time. We're caught up in this time. We always pass from past to future one step at a time. But the universe is way more complex than that, way more circular than that. And that raises all sorts of very interesting questions about our relationship with the past and the future. And of course, it allows our creative imaginations to go wild here, because that then begins to get us to think about, well, how are the past and the future integrated? Are there ways of thinking about this that completely transcend how we usually think about cause and effect. And this is really important. If we're going to understand how we affect the future, we've got to have this sense of imagination and creativity with how we see the world we live in.
Yeah, I think that answers the question wonderfully. And I just love the quote that you said, that light acts as a metronome for the universe, because it's quite apt in the way that, because it is the sounding board on which all life and all of time just exists, and how we move on with everything that we do. So, and just building on this, the central idea, and especially as it was narrated so beautifully in the poem as well. So, in your words, how important is humanity's role in increasing the overall entropy of the universe? Because as you mentioned in the book so beautifully, that humanity is this sort of, by weird chance or through some overlying enterprise, we have been put here to increase the entropy and sort of fast forward this process. So how important do you think that is?
So this is such an intriguing idea, and I should say at the outset, I think actually humanity is so small at the moment that we're probably just a pinprick on the canvas of the universe, even when it comes to entropy. But the idea here, it's grounded in physics and the nature of the universe. So entropy, as I say in the book, is one of those concepts which is deeply misunderstood by so many people, to the frustration of physicists. But essentially, it's just about the usability of energy. And we know from the laws of the universe, almost the immutable laws, energy becomes less and less usable over time. This is the increase in entropy, until eventually one of the potential future scenarios of the universe is that all the usable energy has gone. We end up with heat death. And there's a theory from a gentleman called Jeremy England that this is part of the fundamental nature of the universe. The universe is on this irrevocable move toward heat death. And the faster it can get there, the more this is in line with how the universe is. And so this theory says that there are going to be circumstances where things happen that speed up this movement towards heat death. And there's a very compelling argument that actually humanity and life are part of the speeding up process. If you look at what has happened through the formulation of DNA, leading to all the various plants and animals we have, and the evolutionary process over the last several million years, all the way through to human intelligence, every step in this process has increased the rate in which we use up energy. And you look at humanity now, we are incredibly good at using up energy incredibly fast. Now, we're still very, very small on a universal scale, so I don't think it's going to make much effect. But this is the important point. It seems like there's something in the design of the universe that encourages the emergence of systems such as DNA, of life, of intelligent beings that actually accelerate this pathway toward heat death. And the irony is we actually benefit from this because we get to live our lives while we're using up this energy and accelerating this death point.
I think that sums it up wonderfully, that at the grand scale of things, maybe it doesn't make that big of much of a difference. But to us, it's so crucial. And I mean, yeah, it benefits us, so why not? Right. And it raises all sorts of philosophical questions. I mean, should we be using more energy? Definitely.
Should we be pulling back? What does this mean to sustainability? What does it mean to the nature of being human?
Yeah, so the book as a whole, it talks about our mastery over cause and effect, and how by default it's not benign. So what do you think is this secret ingredient that you would urge the future generations? Because a lot of the audience members here are in high school or are the scientists and future leaders of tomorrow. So what is the secret ingredient that you would urge them to sort of nurture so that they can tip the scales in favor of having a more beneficial relation?
This is such an important point. So to me, there is a secret ingredient or a secret sauce. And it's having, in fact, actually it's two parts. It's having a broad understanding of how all our different types of knowledge and expertise come together to understand the results of our actions. And it's having a sense of responsibility to the future, understanding that everything we do in the present has ripple effects into the future. And I say this because you look at a number of indicators that indicate that we're at a profound tipping point in human history. And we're seeing things happen that have never previously happened in the history of our species. So in the past, we know cause and effect means you do something and in the present and the consequences in the future. And those consequences can be bad, but there are always downsides to those consequences. But in the past, we've survived as a species because we've had enough time to course correct. Every time there's been a bad consequence to our actions, we've had enough time to innovate our way out of it, to come up with more solutions. And that's worked incredibly well, even through the last 200 years of the Industrial Revolution. We've seen an incredible number of bad effects on our lives, on the environment. In fact, actually, it's very true that if you look at almost any bad thing in the world, it's got its roots in a previous good idea in a previous generation.
Definitely, yes.
Yeah. So we've been living in this world, but the trouble is things are accelerating so fast now that we're losing that ability to course correct. So all of these consequences of our actions are building up so fast that if we're not careful, we're going to have catastrophic failure. That means we need to think differently. It means that the thinkers and actors and doers and business leaders and scientists and technologists of the future are going to have a completely different skill set and a completely different way of thinking. And that way of thinking means they need to understand the consequences of their actions from a very broad perspective. They need to, if they're scientists, they need to talk to people in the humanities. I would even say you need to talk to people that have got a religious background, not necessarily because their beliefs are right, but because they have a way of thinking and understanding which is valuable to helping us understand our relationship with the future. This is going to become more important than ever.
I think that brings up a beautiful point, that how, as a species, as a whole, we have to be more open to new ideas. And the easiest way to get new ideas is through conversation, that you talk to people whose backgrounds are very different from your own.
This is just so important. If you don't have those conversations with people that see the world differently, you will never see those opportunities to actually build a better future.
Definitely, yes. And so this brings me to the next point, as you mentioned here as well, that many of the disasters that have happened have to do with something that we did, which we thought is a good thing somewhere in the past. Right. And this is just about how, so the question, what I wanted to ask is basically in the book, in Futurizing, you talk about how we misdisplay data, that we take the data that we have from some good event, and then it's misconstrued to show something else. And it is one of the biggest examples that we have is the Moore's law, that we use, the exponential curve, where we misdisplay data. So how detrimental do you think this has been in the past with all of these? And going ahead in the future, do you think we have learned from these, or it's going to continue?
I don't think we've learned at all. And this comes down to how we persuade people about different ways of thinking about the future, and how we're fooled by data and how data are presented. So you mentioned Moore's law. Moore's law is interesting. So it's this idea that it goes back to this pioneer of the electronics industry, Gordon Moore, who predicted many years ago, or he didn't predict, he said there seems to be a trend that, I forget the exact numbers, but it's roughly every year, the power of computing, and in fact, he looked at it in terms of the number of transistors or switches on a circuit board, doubles periodically. And he says, this seems to be a trend here. Now, what happened with Moore's law was that the semiconductor industry decided that this is a good guide, so they're going to make it happen. They actually came up with a road plan to keep on track with Moore's law. Unfortunately, other people looked at this, and this is an exponential increase because you're looking at a doubling over a set period of time. People looked at this and they drew a line into the future and said, well, if this continues to carry on the way we're going, it's not going to be that long before we have computers that can model the whole human brain. And not so long after that we're going to have computers that are vastly more powerful and more intelligent than people. And they did that by drawing this straight line from the present to the future. The trouble is, exponential extrapolation, which is what this is almost always wrong. because it's one of those trends that we know from physics just cannot continue. There's always going to be a glitch in it. And what happens is these exponential trends, and you hear this all the time with technology innovation. People say technology innovation is expanding or progressing exponentially, which means that just in 10, 20 years, the world is going to be utterly different. It never works that way. And the danger is if we fool people into thinking it does work, we make really bad decisions in the present based on the future. If we've got enough time, I want to give you another example of that. So another example is conversations around population growth. So you go back to the 1960s, and there was a lot of concern about the exponentially increasing population around the world, and it was exponentially increasing there. And the exponential extrapolation said that by the time we get to the end of the millennium, so we get to the 2000s, the population of the world will be so great that everything will collapse. We'll end up in apocalypse, quite literally, because we won't be able to support this many people. And they did it through exponential extrapolation. We know that that was wrong. And we know it was wrong because any sort of event like that is self-limiting. You cannot assume that things grow forever. And there's a beautiful example of this. And I'm actually going to refer to another of my books, Films from the Future, where I talk about a very, very silly movie by Dan Brown. Called Inferno. And it's a book that's about population explosion. And there's a model there, which is actually a model from the real world. It's called Bartlett's Beaker. And this is the hypothetical scenario. This person, Bartlett, said, imagine you have a beaker. And it's 11 o'clock and you put one bacterium in there, and that bacterium doubles every minute. It divides and doubles every minute. And at 12 o'clock, that 1 hour later, that beaker will be full. So this is exponential growth. Every minute, the number of bacteria double. And he asks the question, if you start off with one bacterium at 11 o'clock and at 12 o'clock, the beaker's full, at what time is the beaker half full? And you do the mathematics and you discover that it's 11:59, 1 minute to midnight. And that sounds incredibly scary. And that's the nature of exponential extrapolation. But there's a problem. You look at the biology of that experiment, and you know that for bacterium to grow, they've got to have food, they've got to have oxygen. And at some point very early in that experiment, they're going to run out of oxygen, they're going to run out of everything they need, and the population is going to die and crash. You will never see that exponential extrapolation. And this is the difference between simple mathematics that project into the future badly and wrongly versus reality that looks at other factors. And you can see if you begin to make decisions on the future based on hypothetically what might happen based on flawed mathematics, you're going to make some really bad decisions.
I think that's very cool, well put. And this example brings it up very, very aptly that, mathematically it goes one way, but if you think of it in a very real scenario, it's just not going to work out that way. That there are so many other factors involved that you just cannot think of it that way. Which brings me to another question that I had when I was thinking of your book, that so whenever we talk about all of these exponential growths and when we come to data, there's so many other factors and so many risks that you have. So so some of these risks are obvious. For example, in the bacteria example, we know that they'll need food and oxygen, but there's a lot of other orphan risks. For example, in this bacteria one, now we wouldn't think of it, but even bacteria would need space, right? So now when we think of these orphan risks, our mind is, because of as the name suggests, we're not able to fully grasp the extent of these risks. So with your vast experience in the field, since you've been working in it for the better part of a decade now, so what are the most obvious orphan risks that you think most people often overlook?
Yeah. And so just to sort of underline that, my work talks a lot about what we call orphan risks. So these are the risks that are really important, but people tend to brush them to one side or forget about them, and usually to their detriment. And the problem is with risk, we have learned to think about risk in terms of things that are going to harm our health, things that are going to kill us, things that are going to hurt the environment, or things that are going to make us lose money. Those are the four categories that we're actually pretty good at dealing with risk in. But of course, the things that are important to us, either individually or in our society, go beyond that, way beyond that. So you've got things such as Happiness, something that threatens your happiness is a risk. Your sense of identity, who you actually are, if something threatens that, that's a risk. Your dignity, if something threatens that, that's a risk. And you think about the things that truly motivate people. And more often than not, it's things like their sense of self and sense of dignity more than these other things which are important. So these are the orphan risks that we are not trained to understand and we overlook. But as the world becomes more interconnected, these are the risks that become increasingly important. And so one of the things that we've really got to understand is how we look beyond the obvious when it comes to risk and navigate the non-obvious. And many of these orphan risks are social risks. And that means if we're really going to be successful in the future, we've got to be talking with people who understand society. They understand how people work, how society works, how to identify and protect what is truly important to us. Now, there's one important aspect to this, and that is there is always going to be risk. There's a temptation to say the world will be great if we can get rid of all risk. It's a very bad perspective, simply because there is a way of getting rid of all risk, and that is to be dead. Once you're dead, all risk is gone. But at the same time, you've lost everything that's important to you. So we've got to have a mentality where we say there's always going to be risk, and we need to learn to live with it and navigate around it so we protect what is truly important to us. And that is what I think we've got to start helping people understand and learn how to work with.
I think that's very well worded. Thank you, Professor. And so when it comes to this, that risks involve conversations to be able to take over. And so it basically leads to this fundamental inertia against change that people have. So what do you feel is that one catalyst that brings people out of their fixed mindset and one to one that can adapt finally?
Yeah, so change and uncertainty are interesting. And I don't think people are as adverse to change and uncertainty as we sometimes think. And we all have uncertainty in our lives, and we learn to navigate it very well. But it all comes down to what is most valuable to us. What are we trying to protect? If we can understand what is most valuable versus what we're willing to see change, I think we can be very more positive with how we think about change and uncertainty, because then we focus on the right things rather than the wrong things. But to me, this is really important as we help people understand how to navigate change. Because you can actually develop this idea that, for instance, you look at this idea of dignity, what it means to have dignity as a person. In a changing world, to maintain your dignity, you've also got to change as well. And you've got to learn how to live in a different world. So that is not about resisting change, but it's understanding how to embrace change in a way that protects what's most important to you. And this is something that we can learn. But we can also learn to do this in a couple of other ways. And one of the things I find interesting from science is you talk to people who have gone into science and become scientists because of something inside them. They're motivated by curiosity and awe and wonder. And these are not people who want to stay the same. They're people that are excited about change. They want to be challenged. They want to see different things. They want to be just overawed with stuff that they didn't know before. And this essence of science, I think if we can encourage more people to embrace it, so they become curious, they get excited about what's different, what's new, and they just become overawed by the possibilities. That is one way also to embrace change, I think.
I think that's put really well. So that brings us to the end of the, you could say, planned section of the fireside chat, where we had questions that I had thought of. And now, we have a very engaging audience. We have questions pulled from YouTube in the question and answer panel here. So one audience member asks that in this talk itself and in your work, you've talked a lot about how in order to understand the future, we have to learn about the past. And for that, we have people such as science historians and philosophers and social science experts. So how has your experience been in talking to them about these topics, about the future in relation to the past?
So I cannot emphasize how important it is to talk to people that have studied the past and understand it, but most importantly, studied the nature of humanity in the past. There are some caveats here. So we cannot simply rely on the past chart our way forward to the future. We've got to be more sophisticated than that. But if we ignore the past and we ignore the nature of our humanity and society in the past, we will simply end up making the same mistakes that previous generations have. So I actually think doesn't really matter whether you're a scientist or what. You need to work with people and listen to them, understand them, and have conversations with them. People that see the world and understand the past very, very differently to how you do.
That's really nice. I hope that answers the question for the member. So another audience member has asked us about, so what are your thoughts on the singularity? And I was chuckling a little while reading it because you've explained it quite well in the book. So I hope that the audience would love to hear it in your words.
I do. I actually, yeah. So the book is very wide ranging. It covers physics, it covers art, it covers the nature of being human, and it covers the future of technology, including the singularity. I am a singularity skeptic. So the idea of the singularity is that with accelerating technology innovation and an assumption of exponential growth, going back to exponentials again, we'll get to a point where machines are so intelligent that they're inventing the next generation of intelligent machine faster than we can keep up. And this brings us to a point where we simply cannot predict the future, because now it's a future that's dictated by intelligent machines rather than humans. It's a really intriguing idea. I think philosophically, it's a fantastic idea for stimulating new ways of thinking and new ideas. But I think it's also full of human hubris. I see no evidence that we're actually anywhere close to being on track to developing such machines. And so I think even though some people will claim that we're going to see the singularity maybe in the next sort of 10 to 50 years, I think 50 years from now, the world would be somewhat similar to how it is now. We're going to have some new tech, but we're absolutely not going to have hit that singularity.
All right. Yeah, that definitely answers the question. And so this brings me to the next one. That one, we have a question in the audience that asks, so this human destruction that prevails so all around us, do you think it affects only our planet, or it impacts the entire universe on some scale or the other?
Well, so at a very practical level, we all know that Elon Musk has got aspirations to send hundreds and hundreds of people to Mars. So it's definitely going to affect other planets in the solar system. Whether it goes beyond there, I don't know. And you can look at it metaphysically or in reality. In reality, I think it's going to be a long, long time before human activities extend significantly further than the Earth or even the solar system. On the other hand, you think about this sort of less directly in terms of use of energy and destruction, and more in terms of how information alters things, and it can actually alter things in terms of destruction as well. So we're constantly broadcasting information into the universe. Then the question is, those ripples that come out from our actions and what we do on Earth, will they at some point interface with other societies, other intelligences, other life? And will that flow of information actually have adverse effects? We have no idea there. But of course, this is what science fiction writers do. And this is where science fiction gives us some really intriguing insights into what some of the potential dangers or pitfalls of the future might be.
I think that's well worded. So there's this really simple question in the audience that, okay, Prof, what's your opinion? Do you think time travel is possible?
Oh, sorry, say that again.
I'm sorry. So the question asks, Professor, what's your opinion? Do you think time travel is possible?
Oh, time travel. I will be surprised if it is. Again, if you look at the physics and the theory, it seems increasingly likely that time is somewhat fluid, and some entities, some types of stuff may be able to go back and forth in time. But the bigger question is whether biological organisms like ourselves that are trapped in the flow of time could go backward in time. That is a very different proposition and a very messy one. And I would be very, very surprised if it's possible. And there is one very silly and simple test of this. And the test is, you can actually sort of have the thought experiment that says, well, if at some point in the future of humanity, people can travel in time, they would have traveled back. to us already. So we will already have time travelers in our midst. And therefore, one of the easiest ways of testing whether time travel might be possible in the future is to look for indications that we've already got time travelers here. And to my knowledge, I don't think anybody has found any yet.
I think that answers it very aptly. So the next one that we have is, are there any orphan risks of non-social nature which you think are ignored by mankind, but could have a very grave outcomes if or when they materialize?
Yes. So orphan risks definitely go beyond the social. And so I will give you one example of a risk actually, which I don't think is a significant risk at all, but it's perhaps a good example of this. And it's the idea of creating a destructive black hole through high energy physics experiments. That's, in some ways, it's a social risk because we have to make the decision to carry out these experiments, but it's also a physical risk, but an incredibly small one. Another incredibly small physical risk is the risk of being hit by an asteroid, catastrophically hit by an asteroid. That's actually significantly larger than creating a black hole because it's going to happen at some point, but within our lifetimes, it's a very small risk. But then there are also other non-social risks. So consider this. One of the things that really differentiates our generation is we're just on the cusp of being able to redesign the world we live in, whether that's redesigning biology through manipulating DNA, or whether it's redesigning materials through just changing the way that atoms and molecules are put together, or whether it's redesigning the cyberspace that we increasingly habit just by how we construct that. So now we've effectively got very basic access to the base code of reality, that base code being the base code of atoms and molecules, of DNA, of computer systems and cyber systems. Now we know from early experiments with digital systems that you can create buggy systems and you can crash the whole system if you do the wrong thing. So I would say that one of the more intriguing non-social orphan risks is what happens if we unexpectedly crash reality because of what we're doing with messing around with the base code of reality. I'm hoping we're not going to do that for some time, but it's definitely something we need to think about.
Thank you, Professor. That was very insightful. So why aren't younger students, especially the undergraduate students in universities and colleges, being taught about the ethical aspects of technologies, which just leads from the previous question? And is it being actively talked about in the United States?
Yeah, so it is, but I would say not in the right ways. So I think around the world, there's been an increased awareness that we need to understand the ethics behind the decisions we make when it comes to developing and using new technologies. And certainly there's quite a bit of conversation around that in the United States. But I would say there are two major problems. One is the courses and the programs we use to teach engineering and technology and even science really don't integrate that ethical approach. Usually ethics are an add-on. So for instance, if you look at engineering programs, the ethics courses are usually the courses that students hate because they're badly taught, they're badly conceived, they don't connect with everything else. So we do a really bad job there. And we're generating these technologists who are creating new companies who have never had any training here whatsoever. So that's a problem. The bigger problem, though, is I don't think ethics is the issue. Ethics is important, but it's only one very small part of a bigger way of thinking about the future. Most importantly, whoever we're educating, whichever field they're in, if we assume that everybody potentially has the ability to impact and change the future, we need to be helping them understand how to do that responsibly, how to make responsible decisions, how to think responsibly about the consequences of their actions as future builders. And that to me means that whether you're looking at science or engineering or even the arts and humanities, we need courses and programs around building a more responsible, equitable, vibrant, exciting future together in a very integrated and open-minded way.
Thank you, Professor. That was quite informative. So the next one looks like this person has been following your work for quite a bit, actually. One audience member says, I've been following Andrew for some time. A big fan of his book, Films from the Future, The Technology and Morality of Sci-Fi Movies. So Andrew, what's your opinion on the interplay of science fiction and science? What's the distinction line that we have to draw?
That's a great question. Yeah. So yes, I wrote this book about science fiction movies, and I actually teach this course. We're teaching it at the moment, where my students actually come to class and they watch whole movies together. So we sit back and we get out the popcorn and we'll watch a Hollywood movie. But the book is really about the future and innovating responsibly. But science fiction movies are incredibly powerful here. So the first thing about sci-fi movies is that they are always wrong. The science, no matter how hard they try, is wrong. They take shortcuts, and most of the time,
a few science fiction aficionados in the audience would be a little disappointed to hear that.
I know, and but I'm not denigrating that. I watch and I read a lot of science fiction, but the thing is, it's actually not important, because science fiction movies and books are stories about people and technology in the future, but ultimately they're about people. And they tell stories about the consequences of our actions. And to tell those stories, it's okay to take shortcuts with the science. It's okay to be speculative with the science. It's okay to develop a world which isn't the same as our world, as long as it's self-consistent. The most important thing is, this is a medium where we can reveal aspects of our relationship with technology in the future which are hard to see otherwise. And it's a great leveler. What I love about sci-fi movies is you can get people from all different backgrounds, all different disciplines and areas of expertise, all different ways of thinking in the same movie theater at the same time, having the same emotional experience. And that opens up conversations in a way that very few other mediums do. And to me, that's incredibly exciting.
I agree that is quite exciting. So I'm personally a huge science fiction fan as well. And so I got this question from one of the audience members that, Professor, since we know that, as you just said, science fiction is quite different and we have to draw the line. But do you believe that science fiction is, at least to some extent, a precursor to modern day science? Maybe that creatives come up with the ideas first and then maybe a scientist works on it.
It is. So absolutely, science fiction stimulates scientists and stimulates their imagination. And there are a number of examples of this. So just two examples. Arthur C. Clarke was well known for exploring near-term ideas, which then became a reality. Another speculative fiction writer, Margaret Atwood, plays around with ideas that are very, very close to what scientists do and stimulate them. And then if you look at movies, the movie Minority Report by Steven Spielberg really stands out because Spielberg brought together a group of technologists and futurists to help sort of craft the world of technology he was building. But what happened was, he thought he was pulling on their expertise, but a number of those people went away stimulated by the ideas and began to fold that into the technologies they were building. So there you have this very, very close sort of coupling between science fiction and science and technology. And of course, there are many scientists out there who will tell you that they've been inspired by science fiction. I would say that if you look at all the ideas in science fiction, a very, very small number of those ideas actually come out into reality. But that doesn't matter, I think. I think it's the creative stimulation, the catalyst behind those ideas that is important in science.
That is very insightful, Professor. So one audience member asks, and looks like he's been following your work for quite some time, that what is exactly a risk innovation lab?
So it's tempted to say we find innovative ways of creating new risks, which of course it's not. My work around risk innovation starts off from the perspective where we say that the ways we have thought about risk in the past are not only very conventional, but they're not really fit for purpose for the future we're building, because the future is so different than the past. And therefore, if we're going to thrive in the future, we need to innovate in how we think about risk in exactly the same way as we innovate around technology. So for instance, this idea of orphan risks is a risk innovation because it's an innovation in how we think about and conceptualize risk. So this is what we do in the Risk Innovation Lab. We think in creative and innovative ways about how to approach risk differently as we build the future.
I think many members in the audience are just happy that we're not coming up with new ways to just find risks to our
I
work
know,
now.
yes.
So, Andrew, would you mind giving us a sneak peek into your next book? What are you busy with at the moment?
Oh, goodness me. So I've been playing around with a number of ideas here. So I'm not quite sure which way things will go exactly, but I'll give you two of them. So this is really a sneak peek that nobody has heard before. One idea I've been playing with is getting a sense of how people are really thinking about the future, but not the prominent figures. So we hear a lot from futurists, for instance, about what they think the future is going to be like. We hear very, very little from people that are marginalized. So people in marginalized communities, maybe people that haven't even graduated high school, people that usually aren't sort of front and center of those conversations. And yet they still have a stake in the future. They still have visions of the future they would like. And at some point, I would love to write a book about their perspectives, the voices that you'd never hear talking about the future. So that's one possibility. But there is something else which I'm working on at the moment, which will probably sort of feed into my next book. And it's a concept about how we think about the future. And this is very, very new. So I haven't even formulated these thoughts fully yet. But one of the challenges we have about the future is we either tend to think optimistically about the future. So we say everything's going to get better. Humanity is just going to solve all its problems and we're going to create a utopia. Or we go the other way and say, humanity are just incapable of building a better future, so we're going to end up in disaster. And this is the approach that says we've got to stop doing bad things. When we talk about sustainability, we've got to stop doing stuff. When we talk about responsible innovation, we've got to stop innovating. We've basically got to go back to some sort of hypothetical sort of halcyon past where everything was great. None of those perspectives work. So I wanted to come up with a concept where we can get this idea of excitement and vibrancy and richness about the future at the same time as thinking about how we do this responsibly. And the idea that I'm playing with at the moment actually draws from food. So we all know what umami is in food, that sense of richness that gives food deep value and it gives us deep pleasure as we eat it. And I'm really interested in the metaphor of that with the future. Is there such a thing as social umami? So social umami to me is the essence of society that allows us to find meaning in the future we build. So there's a chance that that might be the focus of my next book.
That sounds very interesting, Professor. I can't wait to read it when it comes out. So, Professor, one question that we have in the audience is, if science fiction ideas simulate current ongoing science experiments?
Some do. You have a vast range of science fiction writers, but you absolutely have some who are following the science closely and really just sort of asking questions about where does that science go. So this is really getting closer to speculative fiction, which is some would say it's a subgenre of science fiction, some would say it's slightly different. But you are absolutely seeing some science fiction writers who are building on current science and just asking those questions, what happens if we go one or two steps further? And that's some of the most interesting and exciting literature out there.
That's quite interesting, Professor. So do you ever think we'll reach a point of Armageddon where robots take over our lives?
Yes and no. So I do not, and if you've watched the movie Terminator or similar movies, I do not think we will find and get to that point. I mean, it's very tempting to think that we will create supercomputers that decide the one thing they really can't stand is humans and they try and get rid of us. I don't think we'll get there because that's very human-centered. It's very hubristic. It's assuming that machines are going to think and act like us, which they almost definitely won't. It's also somewhat defies the laws of thermodynamics in terms of how we build those. What I do think, and this is what really concerns me, is that we'll create machines that learn how to manipulate us. And this is something else I talk about in the book, Films from the Future. So if you think, we like to think that we're all logical, rational beings. We understand the world logically, we make logical decisions. And yet, all of us are full of cognitive biases. We're full of blind spots. The ways we make decisions are actually, they're not scientifically logical most of the time. It's just that we back justify them. And that means that we're very easy to manipulate. You see this at the moment with fake news, with persuasion in society, with how people latch on to very strange ideas in society. This is human nature. Now, what happens if we create an intelligent machine that isn't subject to these biases, but really understands human biases? That then gives it a lever to manipulate us. And if this machine has a set of goals where it can see it can manipulate humans to reach those goals, why would it not do that? This, to me, is a scenario which is actually very plausible. It could be good if we actually have benign machines that help us overcome our biases, but it could be really bad if we're being manipulated by machines. And I write this in the book. If we're manipulated by machines that make us fall in love with them, and this is the weird thing, they make us fall in love with them to the extent that we will do anything for the machines. That is not implausible.
That is really something to think about, Professor. And Professor, so we are well aware that we have to keep the time in mind. So maybe we'll just take the last 2 or 3 questions now. And Professor, this is something I've been thinking of. Your book, as you said in the foreword as well, it's more like a beautiful collection of short essays. Yep. And I found that quite insightful. And especially, I must say, the way that those essays are portrayed, how, you have one essay and it just leads into the other, quite often with the last word being the topic of the next one. It's quite beautiful. So is that how you started with thinking about this book, or is that something that organically happened?
It started fairly early on. That wasn't the original intent. But as I was thinking about this and thinking about how do you capture a multifaceted idea of what the future is and how we think about the future and how we're connected to it, I started off trying to look at all the different aspects of the future and our relationship with it. And I came up with a list of 70 or 80 of these. And then I got really interested in the metaphorical idea of capturing the essence of time and the future in the format of the book. And so that led to the idea of having 60 chapters. So 60 chapters representing the 60 minutes in an hour. So this is the progression of time. And trying to develop a narrative, a story around those 60 chapters. So that was the first step. And then I need to make sure that those told a story together. So as you read it through, first of all, yes, as you say, they're very short, intentionally short, because I wanted these to be short meditations on different aspects of the future, almost like little puzzle pieces where together they create a whole picture. But then as I began writing, I found the beauty of connecting each one to the next. So as you say, every short chapter sort of has a lead into the next one. So you see where the story is going. And it's almost like a nonfiction page turner, I hope. So you get to the end of one chapter and you just want to peep over the page to see, well, where does the story go after this?
That was incredible. And I, for one, as a reader, absolutely love this format. I can honestly say I cannot name any other books that I have read that use this format so beautifully. So, Professor, you work extensively in nanotechnology. So, can you shed some light on the current global initiatives addressing the responsible development and the ethical use of nanotechnology in today's world?
Yes. So this has actually been a very interesting journey. So, of course, nanotechnology or real world nanotechnology it's simply advanced material science, where we're learning how to put atoms and molecules together in very sophisticated ways to create materials with new properties and materials with new capabilities. And very early on in the global development of this is going back 20 or so years, people realize this is such a powerful technology that if we don't think about the consequences, we're going to get it wrong and we're going to lose the trust of people that we hope will use the technology. So early on, there were conversations about what does it mean to do this safely and responsibly? And that led to everything from regulations that determined what companies can and can't do to, and this was more important to me, companies themselves really realizing that if they're going to have a good and a safe and a profitable product, they have to think about the consequences. Now, things have sort of gone a little bit sort of awry over the last few years, but I would say up to 5 or 10 years ago, we had a global landscape where companies were largely doing the right thing with nanotechnology. They were pushing the technology forward at the same time as thinking about how to do it as safely as possible. These days, people talk less about the safety of nanotechnology. That may be because we've actually solved this and everybody is behaving safely. It may just be that people have forgotten to ask those questions and need to be reminded. But the good news is we haven't seen any disasters yet. We've seen really intriguing advances come out of nanotechnology without too many of the downsides. So maybe we did do something right.
That's quite insightful, Professor. Thank you. So, Professor, as you yourself are a prolific science communicator, what about this field excites you?
The field of science communication or nanotechnology, or how big and broad?
As broad as you want it to be.
Yeah. So I would say two things there, and I'm just thinking about sort of science communication more generally. The first thing is, and when I talk about science communication, it's really empowerment and engagement. So I communicate with people to empower them to see the world in different and powerful ways and to make decisions which benefit themselves. And to me, this is incredibly important because we have a bunch of experts around the world that have a lot of knowledge in their heads. If we're going to build a better future together and everybody is part of building that future, we need ways of getting that knowledge out of their heads and into the heads and into the hands of people that are part of building the future. That is an incredibly important aspect of science communication because everybody is part of this enterprise. But the other part is just inspiring people. I went into science because I was inspired by it. I was just awed by the wonder of science and discovery. And I want as many people as possible to have similar experiences. And so we sometimes forget this. It's less about what you can do about the science and more about how the science makes you feel about yourself, about the world you live in, about the future you're building. And I would love to see more people get involved in science communication just to excite and awe and thrill people and help them begin to discover that awe and wonder for themselves as well.
Thank you, Professor. That is really heartwarming and inspiring. So just one last question before I have to finally hand you over to Shruti. So how was your experience at India Science Festival? And what is the significance of public engagement platforms like ISF in bringing credible science to the masses?
Of course, so this has been a fantastic conversation. I would say that anyway, but genuinely, so first of all, I've loved this. I've loved engaging. I've loved the depth and the sophistication of the conversation. I've loved the fact that we've had such great questions from the audience. But more broadly, the platform is so important. These types of conversations with as many people as possible, with it being as accessible as possible to anybody that wants to engage, are just so important. And I think it's a fantastic thing that you're doing here. So huge, big thumbs up all around for this. And please invite me back.
Oh, definitely, Professor, we will. And we are hoping that in subsequent events, we can have you offline for a live session here in India.
That sounds great.
That's all for the fireside chat here from my end. And Shruti, over to you.
Thank you so much, Parth. And of course, on behalf of the entire team at India Science Festival, a very big thank you to Professor Andrew Maynard, who has so graciously given us his time for the past 1 hour.
Hey!